If you've joined us for the last few lectures, you know that industrialization is bringing really important changes to the American economy. Couple lectures down the road, you're going to see this change in the economy spill over into American politics. But today, what I want to talk about is the changes in the social structure that will emanate directly from the results of industrialization. Before I go any further, I want you to understand something about industrialization. I've said this before, but there are a lot of different things that go along with industrialization, some of which are very, very good things, some of which are not so good things. For example, there's some benefits that come along with industrialization that translate into a higher standard of living. There's some side effects. The transportation revolution, as we found out, made it easier to get from point A to point B, and it also hooked up consumers with producers and thereby, again, made the standard of living better for more and more Americans. There were costs. One of the costs was the formation of classes, right? Social classes, an elite class that owned businesses, factories, and the means of production, a small but growing middle class that had some, but probably wanted a little bit more, and a rapidly growing class of people that did not have very much and wanted a lot more, needed a lot more, and really the only thing that these individuals had was their labor that they sold in the marketplace. We'll talk about this formation of classes here in just a few minutes, but one of the individuals that I'd like you to be mindful of when it comes to this lecture is a working class activist from New York by the name of Thomas Skidmore. And what Thomas Skidmore was really worried about when industrialization really begins to take shape in the United States is, are we going down a very similar road that Europe went down maybe 500 years earlier, right? He was worried about the development of an American aristocracy. Quick review, right? An aristocracy in European life was a class of people, an elite class of people that owned land. And the way that Europe's economy worked before the development of capitalism was that wealth emanated from the land. And if you were not born into one of these elite families, there was very little way for you to break out of what you and I would probably consider to be poverty. The reason for that is these elite families simply handed down that land from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. And so social classes and social status was essentially fixed. There was very little way to move it. Now, we really prided ourselves on the idea that we were not Europeans in this capacity, but the problem is, at least as Thomas Skidmore sees it, we're beginning to see an aristocracy of capitalists, people that own factories, that own mills, that own farmland too, but they own the means of production. And he was worried that these individuals, so similar to their European counterparts, were simply handing down the means of production from one generation to the next generation to the next generation. And this wealth just was concentrated into the hands of not only the same family, but the very, very few. It was a very top heavy economy as far as he was concerned. So, what he advocated doing about this would be implementing a heavy inheritance tax. For your notes, what Thomas Skidmore wants the government to do was to tax the inheritances of these large wills, right? So, let's say that your father owns a lot of mills, a lot of factories in Lowell, Massachusetts. Let's just say that, right? And when he dies, according to Skidmore's plan, the government will execute that will, and the eldest son will take over the family business. But the government will also take a good chunk out of that inheritance and use that to, shall we say, spread the wealth a little bit further, right? To put some of that wealth back into the American economy so that those individuals on the bottom rungs of the economic ladder are able to maybe get some traction and scramble their way up it. It's a way of putting wealth back into the economy because 9 times out of 10, when that wealth is stubbornly concentrated in the hands of the few, it just kind of sits there, right? There's only so many yachts, there's only so many fancy homes, there's only so many big ticket items that these ultra rich people need, and therefore it's stemming demand. What Thomas Skidmore wants the government to do is essentially say to these people that stand to inherit a great big deal of property is use it or lose it. You either put it back into the economy or we'll do it for you. That's what I need you to understand about Thomas Skidmore. But back to this class formation, okay? Understand something about this economy, and that is it's a very top-heavy economy. It's a top-heavy economy where the business elite, and by elite I mean wealthy planters in the South, urban merchants, financiers, the business elite of the North, they owned approximately 40% of the wealth. That's very concerning considering on their very best day there may be 5% of the population and probably a little bit less than that. You do see a small but growing middle class, doctors, lawyers, professional people, farmers that had land, but they certainly weren't great big huge plantation owners. What you're seeing more and more of, especially in certain contexts and especially on a concerning level, would be the development of a working poor. These are those individuals that I referenced just a minute ago. Those are the individuals that really only have their labor to sell in the marketplace, and therefore that becomes a really big issue when it comes to whether or not you're able to make it. When those people that own the means of production, when they can dictate the terms to you, the working hours, the pay rate, the conditions of that labor, that's going to put those individuals that are workers at a big disadvantage when it comes to lifting themselves out of poverty, so to speak. Nobody was worried about this so much, aside from people like Thomas Skidmore. One of the primary reasons why was the West. The West was seen as this safety valve, and it had been really for some time. The idea that if you struck out in New England, if you struck out in Pennsylvania, if you just went broke out in the East, you could always move to the West. You could move to Indiana, later on Illinois, later on Iowa. You get the idea. You could move to the West and become a farmer, a property owning farmer. This becomes known as a concept, especially relevant throughout the North, a free labor economy. If you're not satisfied with what your boss is paying you in Philadelphia, if you're just dissatisfied in so many different levels, you're always free to either contract your labor with somebody else, or you can call it quits altogether in the East and strike out to the West. You can go and try your hand as a wheat farmer in the fields of Iowa. That's what I mean when I say a free labor economy. These workers essentially have the freedom of contract, the freedom of choice, and that's not really something that you're going to see in the South. The South's economy is based primarily on slavery, and this is ultimately going to be a huge dividing point, and it will be so really through the American Civil War. But for our purposes here, I do want to talk to you about a group of people that don't get enough attention, at least in my own humble opinion, when it comes to this particular issue in American history, and that would be the middle class. Now, what middle class Americans are really going to kind of take upon themselves would be what you and I would probably call charity, right? Taking care or at least paying attention to those individuals that were not very as fortunate as you were, that was a really big part of what it meant to be middle class. Well, as industrialization continues to reshape American life, you see the development of this social movement that will come to be known as the benevolent empire. Now, for your notes, what the Benevolent Empire was a middle class, reform minded movement. You've got these people that are coming into the cities, and their whole point is to teach workers industrious work habits. Get to work early, right? Stay there until the job is done. And you want to combat these social ills alongside of all of this. And so one of the things that you are going to see the benevolent empire take on very, very directly would be this issue of alcohol, right? These middle class reformers felt that if you took alcohol out of the equation, it would be a situation where all of these other social ills would just simply fall into order. And to really illustrate their point, they came up with, if you're following along with me on the PowerPoint here, what was known as the drunkard's progress. It was this 10-step progress to poverty, misery, and ultimately orphaning your family. It starts out with step one on the left side of that bridge there. It's just taking an innocent drink, no harm in that. But ultimately, if you look at each individual step, what you see is a downward spiral, a downward degeneration of the individual that ultimately ends with bad things happening to you, the alcoholic worker, and even worse things happening to your orphan family. Okay? And so middle class reformers were going into cities like New York trying to instruct American working class individuals. This is how you make it in the world of industry. This is how you get in front of the boss, and this is how you rise. And they were summarily ignored. Not a lot of traction for the benevolent empire. If anything, you see this unlikely alliance between the upper class and the working class, especially when it comes to their unity involving pushing back when it comes to the banning of the sale and distribution of alcoholic beverages. But you're ultimately seeing two different worldviews emerge and emerge relatively quickly in American life. The first is one that was based on morality. What individuals like Thomas Skidmore wanted the government to do is instill a level of moral justice in the marketplace. That the world of industry was not something that should be immune to moral reproach when it comes to its criticism. Simply because the market and what was good for the market did not mean that it was good for the society. And what these individuals that might loosely be described as reformers, what they wanted the government to do is implement market-driven laws based on a sense of morality that made for fair and moral play in the marketplace. Now, as you might guess, because part of the title of this lecture is class conflict, employers saw it very differently. Employers pointed to what they called the equality of opportunity to allow workers to rise in their own life, right? The equality of opportunity emphasized that on paper everybody was equal. Everybody had an equal chance to get rich because that was the essence of capitalism. It didn't care about your background, it didn't care about your race or ethnicity, your religion. If you had a good idea, if you had a good product, then the market would reward you for it. So we don't need all of these moral reform measures, right? This is going to continue to characterize this conflict and debate really for the rest of the 19th century. If anything, it's only going to intensify. One last way that industrialization and this changing economy reshaped the social structure was by inspiring massive waves of immigration from Europe. Immigration is a very natural part of American history. It's been there for as long as we've had American history. But between 1840 and 1860, you begin to see massive waves of immigrants descending upon American shores. And what's drawing these people into the United States would be industrialization and the promise for jobs. One of the groups that I'd like you to be mindful of to that end would be Germans, right? Now, for most of the 19th century, Germany is not the Germany that you think of it as. It's a collection of German individual states. And so there's a lot of there's a lot of tumult. There's a lot of disorder in Germany at this particular moment. Combine that with a lot of opportunity in the United States, and you have a massive wave of German immigrants that are coming into this country for a lot of different reasons, many of which are squarely based on economic opportunity. Not all of these individuals were welcomed with open arms. You do see xenophobic backlashes. Many of these Germans were of the Catholic variety. Some of them were Jewish. All of them spoke different languages, and all of them, to some extent, were the subject of derision and even in some cases discrimination. Xenophobic reactions to this, there is this fear of the other. There's this fear of immigrants in this time period, and certainly the Germans were not immune to that whole process. The even bigger group that I need you to be mindful of would be the Irish. Now, similar to Germany, there's a lot of disorder going on in Ireland at the time, but it's much, much worse there. Approximately 90% of the Irish diet is based on potatoes, right? The consumption of potatoes. And in the 1840s, and then really in the 1850s, you begin to see the potato crop failing, and it leads to what we call this Great Potato Famine. And a lot of these Irish immigrants really don't have any other alternative other than to immigrate to the United States, really for the same reasons that the Germans are coming, right? There are jobs in the United States because industrialization is really reshaping American society and consequently our economy, okay? Much like the Germans, the Irish are not welcomed with open arms for the same reasons, xenophobic reasons, right? But in particular, the Irish probably have it even worse than the Germans. There was approximately a 400-year history of anti-Irish sentiment in the Anglo world, meaning in the world that descended from the British, right? I told you this way, way back at the beginning of the semester that it's going to be Ireland that England will essentially test out as far as the colonization process. And the English consider the Irish to be an inferior race. I know this might sound a little bit strange, but people of the Anglo variety looked upon the Irish as not only another race, but one that was actually inferior to them as well. But it was really anti-Catholic thought that got the Irish into some trouble when you see immigration beginning to emerge in the 1840s and 50s. Part of the reason for that is a book that comes out around that period that's entitled The Foreign Conspiracy Against the Liberties of the United States. For your notes, that is the Bible of anti-Catholicism during this particular time period. And what it emphasized was very quick or very clear. In order to be a good Catholic, your first allegiance had to be to the Vatican. It had to be to the Pope. You couldn't take your marching orders from something like the United States, let alone the Constitution. And so therefore, the Irish are virtually impossible to assimilate based on their religiosity. As a consequence of this xenophobic attitude, what you ultimately see would be the ghettoization of the Irish into specific realms of city life. In Boston, you would see a Irish ghetto springing up in the south side of town. In New York City, that would be Hell's Kitchen. You call that Midtown today. It's the garment district today, but nonetheless, at one point in time, it was very clearly an Irish neighborhood, and this was not necessarily by choice. Similar to what's going to happen in San Francisco with the Chinese and what we call Chinatown, this is really the only place that the Irish were allowed to exist. And it really does beg the question, how free is this free labor? Keep in mind the Irish are coming over to take these jobs that ultimately are being produced by industry. And these jobs are not only tend to be relegated into the meanest and lowest paying of the American economy, there's very, very few ways that they can lift themselves out of out of poverty. And it really does call into question how free is this institution of free labor. Now, the next time we meet, we're going to talk about a little bit of political blowback that is going to also emanate from the system of industrialization. Simply put, people are going to figure it out that when the government makes decisions, many times that can hit you right squarely in the wallet. You'll see what I mean the next time we meet.